Thank you, everybody, for coming in. And you'll see, based on the fact that we're not even at our starting time, but we already have a full house, that this is an important topic to all of us. And so whatever position, whether you're a builder or you are a corporate thinking about adoption, or a student, or somebody that tries to think about it from a policy perspective, this is a topic. And so that's part of what we like to explore at SG Innovate, is the intersection of deep tech, something with a scientific core, and an application, real-life use case that can help move things forward. We like to think of these things as big problems, challenging problems. We don't want to shy away from difficult questions, so we haven't tried to script anything. So this really is going to be a function of how interactive you choose to be. So to the extent you want to ask questions of our panelists, then it's really on your shoulders. I have my own questions that I'd like to ask, but I'm going to go to two things. Slido, for those that prefer not to sort of stand up and say, this is my question. And for those that don't mind the old-fashioned raise your hand, please feel free to do that. But again, to repeat, it's a function of how much you want to know and how much you want to ask questions. Otherwise, I can just sort of ask away. So, as always, for those that have been at SG Innovate, we don't seek to have a right or a wrong conclusion. We seek to just have the discussion. People form their own conclusions, and it's incumbent on all of us to try and be thoughtful and engaged. So we don't try to say, think this or think that. We just say, here's what's on our mind, and you have what's on your mind. I'm going to start, as I always do, by having a little bit of a memory moment. So what I'm going to do is ask one of my teammates to jump up and take a pic. So if everybody could please stand up and kind of do the 1, 2, 3 toward the camera. If you don't want to be involved because of data privacy concerns, then please look away or look at your shoes. But otherwise, you're going to have a smiling face. Okay, Jessen, everybody up. Let's go, please. And Hongyi and Aisha. You want to give us a shout out, Justin, on the...
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Hang on one more.
Like it.
1, 2, 3. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
It was that easy. Okay. We're going to move this one up. Yeah. What I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Hongyi and Aisha to join me on stage, just so that you guys know, because we're seated close to each other, if your mics are on at the same time, we'll get a little bit of feedback. So when you're not sharing your thoughts, just switch to off. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I think it's always better for leaders to introduce themselves than to have some biography read about them. So I will now ask Hongyi and Aisha to say whatever they want to say about themselves and their work, and then I will jump in with some questions, and please be thinking about what's on your mind. So, Hongyi.
Hi everyone, my name's Hong. So I currently work at GovTech, and I head up the Open Government Products team. And basically what we do is we proactively try to identify things that we think the government should be doing in the public sector that can be improved with technology. We build prototypes around that, and then we go and advocate and try to evangelize and get them to buy into the idea, and then we build out the whole product. So unlike the traditional approach of government projects where it's sort of top-down and these big, massive projects, this is supposed to be like ground-up, where we identify opportunities, build prototypes and small proof of concepts in small areas to sort of show their validity and and push for it its adoption. So prior to that, I was at Google for a couple of years. I worked on the image search teams, as well as the distributed databases team. And prior to that, I was, I studied economics and computer science and a little bit of architecture. So that's roughly me.
Awesome. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha Khanna, and I am the co-founder of Addo AI, and we build AI solutions. We're a bunch of machine learning engineers, data scientists, and cloud architects, and we build AI engines and AI-powered platforms for large telcos, logistics companies, and financial companies across Asia and the Middle East. I have been I started off as a software engineer on Wall Street 20 years ago, and since then I've been doing kind of computational biology, applied statistics, and software engineering. And a few years ago, about 5 years ago, I also started a charity called 21st Century Girls because I saw that not enough women were in tech and AI. And so we have been teaching girls all over Singapore the basics of Python. And we've also now started teaching girls the basics of artificial intelligence.
Okay, so there you go. So those are our two panelists, and we're going to jump right in. So the topic is AI for good. We can kind of take that in a variety of ways, but here's what I'd like to start off with. What do we mean by good, and how do we think of AI playing a role in this thing called good? Do we mean good for society or good for corporations, or how do we want to approach this? Because I want to try and think about what AI for good means, because it helps frame some of our ongoing discussion. Those are not, of course, the same thing. What's good for a corporation may be incompatible with what's good for society and some of these things. So AI for good. Aisha, when you think about this, and also perhaps bring in your experience with what's happening in Pakistan and some of the engineers and the effect on society. So do you want to take us in a new direction?
Yeah, I've never seen anyone want to do AI for good. I've never seen anyone start something in their life because they wanted to try a technology for good. They usually are interested in solving a problem, something that bothers them. We work a lot with micro loans and credit scoring for the underbanked in Asia. That's the problem. When you solve that problem, it turns out to be good for the hundreds of millions of underbanked. It also turns out to be good for the insurance companies and the banks that are trying to make money off of it. I think that's the right way to think about it. Who wants to think about the technology first? So I have a problem with this whole notion of starting with AI and then for good later. I think we should start with the problem first and then think about it. I mean, I have a lot of CEOs, and they'll go and watch a movie like Black Panther, or they'll see the latest cover of Wired magazine, and they're like, Aisha, let's do some AI. And I'm like, why? Why do you want to do it? And I actually think that's a really important question, because you make a series of decisions after that, including ethical decisions. And you need to have a North Star, a reason why you're doing it, and that may or may not be good for your business, or may not be good for society. Ultimately, it's for governance of AI to determine whether it's allowed to exist in terms of being good for the nation.
So, Hong, you're involved in a lot of different elements that include data and the use of data. Can you spend a moment articulating for us so we can get our heads around it? When we use the expression AI, do we mean machine learning? Do we mean deep learning? I mean, because I'm sure you confront this issue a lot, that AI is used broadly and generically. So before we dig too deep, can you help us frame how we ought to approach this concept of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, of course. So I think the biggest, I think the reason why AI is such a, hot idea right now is that it sort of captures the imagination, right? That you have these artificial robot people who can think and act just like us, and are they really human? Or should they be allowed to make decisions? And it creates all these wonderful philosophical questions that you can discuss over wine. But the reality is that artificial intelligence is artificial. It's a trick. It's something that pretends to be intelligent but isn't. And if you frame it that way, you actually realize that AI is a fairly old technology, right? And so, for example, let's say tic-tac-toe. Tic-tac-toe is a fairly straightforward, simple game. And you could write in probably 20 to 30 lines of code, simple rules that would play tic-tac-toe 100% effectively against anybody. That's an artificial intelligence, and then you can go from there to deeper, to more rules-based systems, and to neural networks, and to adversarial networks and things like that. But in the end, that's why it's artificial. It's you do something that in certain scenarios pretends to behave sort of like how a human or intelligence would behave. Now the reason why. I guess more recently it's become interesting is because of deep learning and because of a bunch of the advances that we've had recently, things that we thought previously sort of not impossible but infeasible for computers to do, we realized actually are now within reach. So things like image recognition, right? Previously, a lot of artificial intelligence was basically a human thinking really hard and writing down like the rules, like, you know, if there is more than a certain amount of blue in the picture and the top half is lighter than the bottom half, then this is probably a picture of the ocean and something like that. But now we've gotten to the stage, quite interestingly, where we can use AI to solve problems that we don't actually understand how they're doing. So this is where the deep learning stuff comes in, right? So if you have a neural network, I just feed it a whole bunch of images and a whole bunch of, and I have people sort of mark out where the cars and the images are or whatever, and therefore now I have an AI to determine, you know, given a picture, whether or not there's a car in the picture. And the network is sufficiently complicated that we don't understand how. And so it is this sort of convergence essentially right now where you have systems that are sufficiently complicated that we can't understand them, and yet sort of ironically, so simple for someone to train and use that anyone can use them. So no one can understand them. Even the most sophisticated AI researcher, you give him a neural network map, he can't tell you what's going on. But anybody can literally, within half an hour, you just go online, you search, like, getting started with AI, you feed it a bunch of pictures of cats and then pictures of non-cats, you click the ones which are cats, and ta-da, you have one. And so that's why it's interesting nowadays. It's not so much that AI as a concept is new, it's that it has both gotten to a stage simultaneously of it being complicated enough that we can't really explain how it does what it does, but yet simple enough that anyone can do it, that we've sort of stumbled upon this kind of magic that now we need to talk about what we do with it.
All right, so I've got to pick up on what Hong just said here. So Aisha, one of the big buzzwords for adoptability would be explainable AI or transparent AI. And Hong just mentioned an example. Hey, it's amazing, but it's maybe a little bit difficult to understand, or in many cases, black box. When you think about the future of artificial intelligence, can you share with us some perspectives on the importance of explainability in terms of lowering anxiety about this idea of a mysterious thing that we don't understand, but it tells us what to do?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I would divide things into kind of three boxes. One would be interpretability. And I think that's where the AI engineer comes in, and even he or she struggles to understand kind of how the neural network came up with certain things for very complicated kind of GANs or deep learning or reinforcement learning. Then there is explainability. That is your business people. How have you explained it so that they more or less understand what it's doing? And the third part is your values. Now you know how it works. Now do you feel comfortable with what you have built or not? Unfortunately, the interpretability is low at the moment. That doesn't mean it's impossible. If you worked with less precise, slower algorithms, you would have more interpretability. But they would be less precise, they wouldn't go as fast. And as I was saying earlier, all of us like to sit here and we like to talk about ethics and transparency and accountability, but the stock market does not forgive companies that actually choose to make explainable algorithms over ones that are faster and more precise. So now we're left in a quandary. The GDPR, which is a regulation in the European Union, has taken a step forward, right? So they've said, you know what, stop. You're right. Your data, the decisions that an algorithm makes for you, it is your right to know how it did that. Article 22, it's vague, but it's a start. And I think we in Asia can learn something from it. I think we will, as it begins to maybe fine certain big companies or force by regulation companies to comply with it, we will maybe see some innovation now, and some researchers and grants and others more will come out in this area of explainable AI. I think the IMDA is trying to do that. Again, the guidelines are just guidelines, but they have put in certain things where they think along the process of developing AI engines, where you should stop and consider things like explaining it to the business users, how your data governance should be done, maybe some ethical considerations at all levels, from the engineer to the business stakeholder, all the way up to the consumer. So this area, this black box, we try to open it to a degree. And at least the people working on it at a minimum should try to have some tools to inspect it. I think we'll see that innovation at some point. one of the people who works in my company does a lot of work for one of the top militaries in the world in autonomous robots. But you know what? When it comes to the kill switch, they don't make it autonomous because we are just not sure why it makes that ultimate decision.
Okay, so let me build on this point then, Hong, which is GDPR, some would say GDPR and restrictive, if I can use the word, use of data compared to other countries. Let me juxtapose our favorite discussion, which is China's use of data. I think everybody in the room would generally agree that facial recognition software, if you're going to be an investor, you better put your money there and not into a different country, because the use cases are driving the iteration and the improvement at a faster rate. We'll talk in a minute about San Francisco's view on facial recognition. But in terms of use of data, Hong, from a perspective of improving models, do we want to think about more assertive use, and I'm not saying we as in Singapore, but I'm saying we as in people, more assertive use of data to better train more accurate models, or do we want to think about a cautious prudence, sort of drip feeding as we approach this use of AI?
I don't think that's a sort of like a useful way of framing it, because I get where you're getting. So the sort of implicit assumption in that question is that AI is this, like, you know, it's kind of like Skynet, right? There is one AI thing in the world, and do we like feed it big or feed it slow? And if we feed it too fast, does it grow too big and eat us up? And I think that that sort of the underlying assumption that we have around discussions about AI right now is this idea that there's a foregone conclusion almost in all these discussions that the AI will be our overlord, and the question is, how much do we want to trust it? Which I think is incorrect, because there already are systems which are extremely complicated and extremely intelligent that we don't understand, that already govern a big part of our lives, and they're called other human beings. And we trust other human beings to do all kinds of things, right? We have human beings, you know, for example, cook our food, and we have human beings, enforce laws, and judges, and doctors, and soldiers, and we don't inspect probes into their brains and like ask them to you know, and figure out how they make every single decision and make sure it's correct. What we do is we just accept that human beings are flawed, and we have an entire system of managing them called governance and management. And you know, all of society is a system all of modern society is essentially a system for human beings to work with other human beings, knowing that they are fallible. And I think that's kind of how we need to take an approach to AI, which is not so much about like, you know, do we feed it a little bit or do we feed it a lot of data? But like, all right, if I were to have a human being do this, how would I do this, right? So for let's say I have an AI for something simple like for detecting cancer in scans. And now the question is, do we trust it? Are we putting our lives in its hands? It was like, well, I mean, to some degree, yes, but I also do that in the hands of the, radiographer. And the way you do that is you have him give an approval, and once he's done it, once he's done it for a few years and seems to be competent at his job, then I let him do it on his own. But until then, I have someone oversee him. And that's the same thing for policemen, right? And that's the same thing. And that's the same thing for judges, and that's the same thing for politicians, and same thing for chefs. You start with something small, and you have the AI do your work for you, but you just check it to be, yep, he's more or less doing the right thing. And if there's any exceptions or any complaints, you deal with it. And so when feeding it data, you need to look at it in a similar manner, which is that the amount of data you feed it really just depends on what your failure mode is, right? So if your AI is meant to do something simple, right? If your AI is just meant to, like, for example, have a camera on the coffee machine and tell me when the coffee is done, then sure, feed it all the coffee machines in the world and have it view all this, and you can tell. Now, if you're doing something like, for example, identifying potential criminals and sending police after them. Right, like so there's this Minority Report style thing where you have like image recognition and facial recognition all over the city. Do you feed it everyone's faces? So the question is like, well, all right. Firstly, on the pure cybersecurity front, is it very secure? Because, turns out computer systems get hacked, and having one system with all the data of everyone's faces seems to be, it's not about the AI having the problem with it, it's that human beings want to get access to that and do other things with it. So that's the first one. But on the second bit, which in terms of its ability to sort of do its job better, it's like, well, theoretically, yeah, if it could just train it to do its job better, obviously, I would rather an AI which did its jobs better than worse. Now, the deeper question then is that, what are you training it to do, right? And so it is very, very easy to train an AI to do more or less whatever you want, because you can train a human being to do more or less whatever you want. You can train it to be, if you feed it data and you train it to be sort of to be very good at identifying criminals, that's true. But you might also train it to be racist, which has happened in a lot of cases. And so I think the question is not so much about the amount of data that should go into it, but what the bounds are on what it's doing and where you're deploying it, and then you feed it as much data as you can to get it as good as its job within those bounds. So don't create Skynet, but if you're trying to get something figure out what makes good coffee, then sure, give it all the data you want.
Okay, so if I understand your point is, let's agree on the use case, and if we agree on the use case, then data ought not to be the constraint.
Yeah, there is no measure of more. It's like asking how much salt should I put in a dish? It depends on what you're cooking. And if you are doing something that needs it, okay. If you're doing this and doesn't need it, okay. The question in the case of AI is are you governing your AI correctly? And if you're governing your AI correctly, the amount of data you feed it is sort of irrelevant. Yeah.
Okay. How do you want to think of standards then? Because you would also accept that there's asymmetric development in different countries. So although we're all humans, we're not necessarily building systems at some sort of equivalent level. So ought there to be some sort of governing body? What's the role, if any, for some larger development of shared values? Because if we have very asymmetric levels of AI adoption, how does that then play out in terms of humanity, right? So I'm not disagreeing on the point of it depends on the use case, but one could argue if country X is using it in a different way than country Y, there are today some balances, some checks and balances, but that is a concern that many people have about where AI goes. And I'm using the term broadly just for ease of illustration. So I don't mind who wants to jump in, but I'm thinking about asymmetric development, and ought there be some larger body? I don't want to invoke the United Nations or World Bank, but something that brings people together on some shared platform. Yes or no, or everybody go for it?
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at this both from, I guess, the moral perspective as well as the sort of practical one. From the moral perspective, the AI is kind of like electricity in the sense that if you were to sort of look at the development, human development, right? It used to be that you are limited by the amount of the amount of energy and force your muscles could generate. And so then we figured out, oil and gas and electricity and all these things, and then we weren't limited by that anymore, that physical boundary, and, various stages of human development along the way. But there's always been one big limit to human development, which is there's been one brain per person. And given that there's one brain per person, there's only, and we have more or less, relatively speaking, a whole bunch of energy, how valuable can we make things, and that has been how much GDP can you generate, and it was basically a brain per person worth of GDP, which means that average income couldn't go beyond the one brain per person limit as long as the brain power was the limiting factor. And so the thing that AI allows you to do is something that are things that were technically possible before at a small scale, but are now possible at a big scale. And so the facial recognition is a simple example, right? It was always possible if you were to hire an army of interns to go through a whole bunch of pictures and find a guy. Now the question is, are you going to do but it used to be that you only could do this, when you really, really, really had something to do. Whereas now you can do this literally for everyone all the time. And so governing the use of AI is kind of like governing the use of electricity or even just computers in general, which is, turns out there are these things that we thought previously were impossible, and we had structured a society around it. And now if you remove these constraints, does society crumble? And I think the answer, I think rather than governing AI, you need to govern particularly the use cases themselves, whether you achieve them via AI or whether you achieve them via armies of interns. So that's on like the moral front. Sorry.
That's okay. Let me, Aisha, I want to try and come into this point because Li Kai-fu obviously has recently written a book about the AI race between China and the United States. And when we had Kai-fu here a couple of months ago, part of his statement was his fear about, quote, AI in the future is not Skynet or unintended military application. It's the implication on society and massive displacement of jobs and people and implication on sort of social definitions. What do I do for a job? What do you do for a job? Because that's today how we relate to each other. So let me pick up this idea of when we think of AI and asymmetry and its implications on people, what do you see when you look into the future? Are you sort of a net job loss believer, a net job zero because we'll all just do something different than what we're currently doing, but it's still going to be cool and everybody will have a job? What are your thoughts on this?
So I'm a believer that the future will be what we make of it, essentially. So let me give you an example. About 2 months ago, I was in a taxi. I was going to East Coast Park, and this really wonderful taxi driver was giving me advice on how to exercise. And then, he's like, you should exercise more. And I was like, you're right. And then he said, what do you do? And I said, I run this artificial intelligence solutions firm. And he must have been in his 50s, and he said, my daughter, she just graduated from one of the polys, and my son's in the Navy, and I drive Grab 12 hours a day. What does it mean for all our careers? And so I spent some time talking to him, and I think it's really important that we are not patronizing. It's not a bunch of elites who are engineers or business people or us sitting on some panel talking about AI, but that we empower people so that they have agency in this future and they can make their own decisions and they actually understand its implications. So, for example, everybody should know the basics of how artificial intelligence affects jobs. If that taxi driver knows that there are going to be autonomous vehicles and he's going to have less jobs, you know what? He's smart enough. He was pretty smart. He's smarter than I was. So he can make some decisions. The problem is that we tend to assume that there are a few people and everybody else is just sitting there passively looking at a movie. I go to so many conferences where person after person comes out and says, this is what will happen to the future of jobs. This is what robots will do for the elderly. This is what will happen in airports. And everybody is just watching this movie. But you know what? It's time to stop watching. This is your life. This is each of our lives. And I think none of us has an excuse, no matter our age, our gender, our interest, not to know the basics of how it will affect your children and how it will affect your job. And once we start making these courses palatable, understandable, and in Singapore, we're a small enough country that I think we can educate most people, then people will begin to find jobs and prepare themselves for jobs adequately. I can tell you that I build AI solutions, and yes, jobs are lost. But I can also tell you those who look at it in a proactive manner and try to work with the insights the machine gives and work with their executives to do more with it, they get promoted, they do well. So I think that it's time that we stop telling people what to do. We just give them information, give them the skills, and empower them. And that's pretty much why I started my charity. And it's really been gratifying to see how much more confident the girls feel after they take a course in AI.
Let me come on. I'm going to come out and just ask if anybody has a question in a moment. But one that I'd like to ask here, and I'm not going to try and arrow anybody, but this idea that an implied path ahead requires some decisions on values and how do we want to think of the use of some of these tools as tools. Now the question is framed as cultures have different values, cultures have different priorities and so on. In order for us to try and think about this topic of AI, do we need to think about more homogeneity, we try and get to a shared baseline of values when we think of these tools, or no, the tools ought to be defined in the context of each and every local culture, and the use of those tools ought to be the remit of those local cultures. Any sense on this topic of how we want to think of this as one big society, or thousands of smaller societies?
So I guess the question is what the intervention point is. I am of the belief that it's not useful to try and ask what we want like AI to build in terms of society. It's because you can't block it. Basically, it's literally as I see it as literally as inevitable as the use of metal and the use of electricity and the use of computers. It's just the easiest way to sort of for a culture to dominate another culture is to just have more productivity overall. And there is absolutely no doubt that the limiting factor of productivity in a knowledge economy nowadays is not your access to oil or your access to physical land. It is the amount of brain power you have and doing things with brains. And if AI can make, not replace humans fully, but essentially multiply the amount of brain power that you have in your economy, that economy will do better, and overall the total productivity will be increased. And so the way to look at it is in terms of where are the places. So there are two things you need to look at. One is where do you deploy these solutions in order to achieve sort of maximum productivity, and two, how is this productivity and the gains from that distributed across society? And so industrial revolution, right? Simple thing. Industrial revolution, massive productivity increase, massive drop in quality of life because the productivity increase was not distributed usefully. And so when you're talking about sharing values, like how we want to angle this, it's not so much you're looking at it a bit more abstractly. So it's not so much AI specific, but more in terms of what how are you distributing wealth, and what is your position on that? Because for just like when once we have energy with oil and electricity and all that sort of thing, people with bigger muscles don't necessarily make more money and kill more, hunt more and do things like that. And they're not valuable anymore. So it's more of a question of how do you train people to adjust to what their productive role in this new space. And so I think in the different parts of the world, people who try to hang on too tightly to where they were, to what we have right now, they'll do that for probably another 20, 30 years, but soon they'll realize that the rest of the world will just move on by. Everyone's smart, everyone who's capable will move out of there, and you'll just become these little impoverished artifacts, and that the rest of the world will look on just as primitive as we look on as primitive civilizations, because it's cool and it's theirs, and there's cultural appreciation to go on there, but in the end, you can't act to preserve these little micro-societies. The world right now, because of computerization, because of you can go traveling around the world and you will find Coca-Cola and Starbucks and McDonald's and everything from the middle of New York City all the way down to developing country villages. Well, not quite villages, but you get my point. And so I don't think you have a choice. I don't think you can say we are going to have different societies and different cultures and they're going to have different rules on AI, and here the AI is allowed to be really, really smart and here the AI is allowed to be really, really dumb. I think that we are going to converge to sort of homogeneous, not quite homogeneous, but more homogeneous society based on what our technological capabilities are. And the real difference between different societies and different countries will be how they treat social integration given this level of technological sophistication. So it boils back down, ironically, once you have wealth, what boils back down to is sort of cultural integration given wealth rather than anything to do with AI specifically.
Aisha, are you a believer in universal basic income when we think about this idea of social effect and redistribution? Because concentration of wealth, concentration of power, especially now in the land of big tech, is increasing, and some of that segmentation is significant. Now we think about another era. I'm just interested in perhaps some of your thoughts on, some people say tax automation, some people think, universal basic income. Any perspective on that from where you sit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are things that are still need to be worked out from a macroeconomic perspective in terms of the impact it has on the management of the economy. Universal basic income, for example, sounds like a good idea, but can a government or a country afford it? But what is the right of every human being or every citizen is that when there is a displacement due to automation or machines, there is some floor for a while they reskill themselves. And then, of course, you think about the fact that if they're very old, then there are other mechanisms that welfare states and other Singapore and other countries have their own mechanisms for taking care of those people. So what I'm always concerned about is just putting money as a floor is not enough. You need to, again, empower people to find meaning and meaningful work in this new environment. And of course, that costs something. So that will cost and have to be included in the budget of that economy. But I wouldn't necessarily call it universal basic income. By the way, nobody knows yet. The good thing about this panel is there's almost no right answer to what Steve is asking. He knows that. But that's awesome. I think we should have these debates everywhere, in schools, in community centers, and right here.
Let me come on, and I'm going to come out on the next question here. So. No way to avoid arrowing Hong on this one. Is GovTech thinking about using data science and AI for social services, i.e. Prediction on recidivism for those that would be prior offenders coming back out into society? How do we think about who ought to have which type of healthcare and which type of education? Are those positive examples of potential use cases in terms of providing value to any, we'll just say any society?
So short answer, yes. We are looking at how to essentially improve the efficiency of a lot of these things, which are right now very, very manual processes. And the question is just simply, again, to what extent and what is the governance around it? So we already exercise a lot of these judgment calls, right? So for example, social services, you have caseworkers, and caseworkers will have to make a case when you're sort of going for aid and things like that. Like, will this person actually use it? Oh, neat. If you help this person, if you give him aid, it does. Does he? Do you think he'll benefit from this sort of help? In terms of recidivism, you already have judges who do this, and they make judgment calls based on a history of cases. And they can tell you, they can write a story in words about why I made this decision and why. But the fact is that that story, while is interpretable somewhat, really is only it's a tiny fraction of a percent of the actual process of going on inside a judge's head, because almost by definition, if it was simple enough to write if it was easy enough for us to write and explain the algorithm that a judge uses for deciding these things and everyone to understand it, then we would need to hire judges. That's a simple sort of program that you run through. So there's judgment calls involved. So you will start with You'll start with really, really basic things that humans that you can get humans out of loop. And so the question is, the higher up you go in levels of sophistication, the less yield you have in terms of the gains of manpower saved, and the less reliable the AI is. So simple things you start with are, all right, let's just filter out everybody, just simple rules-based systems, right? So let's say you're looking at fraud cases, right? So a simple filter would be, a simple AI would be, I automatically ignore all the cases below $10 or something like that, and I look at everything above. That's theoretically an AI that you could use. It just filters out, and you go beyond that, would be another sanity check AI would be, if someone's doing 10,000 transactions a day, and the average is 5, then that's probably fraud, right? And then you would have, and you could go from there. And so instead of a human being go through these things one by one, you would detect these sort of more trivial cases, and you would eliminate eliminate a whole bunch of human manpower that does this by hand. The obvious one is like character recognition, right? And simple like as character recognition and simple checking to see if all the fields are complete. So you have in a lot of organizations and a lot of the government armies of people whose job it is to get your government forms, look at them, type them into a computer, and then check to make sure all the fields are filled out. This is something you could obviously automate, and I think there's no dispute that using a computer to emulate this human's job is a good thing because that frees up a lot of human manpower to, firstly, it makes it go a lot faster and go on further. And then you get to some of the more esoteric edge cases, right? So for example, recidivism. Let me see if I can remember this correctly. I remember there was a paper on using artificial intelligence to predict likelihood of recidivism in granting parole or something like that. And it turns out you can train an AI to do two things in this scenario. Let's say you're training an AI to grant parole on likelihood of recidivism. You can, one, train an AI to minimize the recidivism when granting parole, meaning that I only grant parole to the people who are least likely. So you want to minimize the number of people who you grant parole to who go ahead and commit another crime. And two, you can train an AI to emulate the kind of decision the human judges make. And it turns out they're not the same thing. It turns out human judges don't optimize they're not optimal in terms of the recidivism. In other words, human judges actually, like, you can train an AI to do better than a human in terms of minimizing the number of people who it grants parole to who go back and commit a crime. And so this is forcing us to sort of like to face these things, right? Which is that in this case where we have this idea that the human is the upper bar of where it goes. But if the AI can do better, are we trying to be better than? Are we trying to be human or better than human? Personally, I think that the reason why this is hard is because a lot of human society is sort of prefaced on this underlying assumption of mandate. And we sort of implicitly accept that other humans can judge us, and we do not accept that arbitrary systems made of silicon can judge us. And so we sort of like, and so I think we'll hit a sort of stable scenario where what is going to end up happening is, even though it functions strictly worse, we are going to subject AI to human oversight because we just sort of instinctively trust that better. Kind of like how, theoretically, a lot of flights, you could actually, I mean, again, I'm not a pilot, so like maybe I'm talking trash here, but my understanding is that a lot of flying is autopilotable, and a lot of pilot error actually causes more plane crashes. But people aren't going to fly on pilotless planes just at an instinctive level. And I think that's going to be the limiting factor more so than any kind of technical limitation.
Although I guess it depends on everybody's personal appetite, because I think, picking up on the point, it's kind of odd that if you can prove, which evidence would argue in favor, that autonomous vehicles tend to have fewer mistakes in a controlled environment than human drivers do, but we're anxious about adopting autonomous vehicles. So clearly there's level 3, level 4, level 5, there's different levels. But I'll share a personal example, which is when I was flying into Luxembourg not too long ago, and it was very foggy and rainy, and the pilot came on and said, we have two choices, either we go somewhere else and land, or we're gonna auto land. And he basically said, we're gonna auto land. So it's fine to fly on autopilot. Everybody knows 98% of the flight, the pilots are just there in case there's a problem. But in this particular case, he said, we're going to auto land. So we engaged auto landing. And basically his message was, this is outside my range of comfort or capability, and because the airport has a lot of systems and the plane has a lot of systems, in this case the plane's going to land itself. And it was probably the silky smoothest landing that I've had, but you could barely see outside the window. And in this case, I took comfort thinking that there was more capabilities being introduced than the pilot saying, hey, I'll give it my best shot. So in that case, who knows where technology goes? Aisha, let me try and come to you on this one. When we think about this idea, Hong just mentioned, there could be a racist system, there could be a whatever system. How do we think of this idea, and you knew we had to come to it at some point, bias? How do we think of good algorithms, unbiased? What's the role of having the right individuals, because if it's a bunch of guys in the room from a certain background, can the algo unintentionally be biased? We're all biased. It's just that we have inherent bias, and sometimes we understand it, and sometimes we don't. When you work with different people building systems, building algorithms, and so on, how do you personally think of this issue of the best possible non-biased system and non-biased group of people?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And actually, my co-founder's PhD is in bias and AI, and it's used by the Dutch Netherlands judicial system. Some of the work that he did. Basically, there are a couple of things. One comes back to the governance of the process. How are you getting the data that you're putting in? What is the lineage and transparency of the data that you're putting in? Because at the moment, for better or for worse, we are reliant on a lot of data for our AI algorithms. Now, there is a whole other set of research being done in AI for small data, which is, I think, quite interesting, and another one altogether, which will move away from this kind of reinforcement and deep learning into something that resembles kind of symbolic neural systems more. So I think there's always R&D happening, but right now, the data has a lot to do with being at fault. And there are two ways. There's data, but then there's also checks that you can make, algorithmic checks that you can make once you get a result. And those, going through that set of algorithmic checks, and we just have a checklist of those, is very important, and at the same time constantly doing data exploration and looking at your data. There's a tendency for people to get so excited about AI, even our own team members, that they just jump to the AI modeling. Whereas there's a very important stage, pre-modeling stage, which is actually looking at your data. And it's not very sexy and doesn't seem very interesting, but actually it's critical. And you have to inspect it, and you can actually unveil and uncover a lot of bias over there. Now, sometimes people just don't notice bias, and this is what you guys were talking about earlier when you said that systems can be biased, and that's because there's not enough diversity in them. The classic example being Google Images, when the African Americans or dark brown people like myself were tagged as gorillas because all the white, Caucasian PhD students from Stanford and Berkeley were using their own pictures to train the facial recognition systems. Or when there was an HR recruitment system that was just copying what the male HR director had said and kept selecting men as the best people for the job. And they're like, wow, it must be so smart, because that means men must be better. But they're not better, as we know in general. And more than that, it takes a woman to kind of point out. So you need diversity. You need more ethnicities. You need more gender. And you don't need ageism. Now that I'm growing older, I insist that people of all ages be part of this new world that we're going into. So these are some of the ways that we can make sure. So it's checks and balances, both technical, algorithmic, and also in the diversity of your team, and also in your inspection of the data. I think this is important.
Let me go out because I've promised several times I would. Anybody want to just shout out a question for either of the two panelists? Yes, please. I mean, I know we have a microphone, but if you're not shy, then just go ahead and shout it out.
A particular use case or like industry or something that you're thinking about?
I mean, for example, back to the
Okay, yeah. So this is the example. So the question was, for those of you who can't hear, the problem with AI is that, well, the advantage and problem with AI is that it scales very well. Means that you can take something that you can go all across the world, you can replicate it, and you can do it 1 billion times over. But it also creates a forest fire style vulnerability where the entire population, if the whole world is running on the same AI, and that AI happens to have a flaw, then that flaw, if exploited, now affects everyone. And you can see particular examples of this, right? So, for example, with radicalization is a perfect example of this, right? Like these outrage-based videos, the reason why you have a lot more radicalization is because if you watch, like the AI designed to, for example, if you look at a picture of a cat, decides that you like more pictures of cats and shows you that, or if you like sewing, shows you more videos of sewing, also shows you that, if you like religious extremism, we will show you a lot more videos of religious extremism, and then suddenly the whole world is now watching a lot more sort of violence-inducing videos because of this single YouTube algorithm. And the question is, all right, well, should we take the homogeneous approach or the heterogeneous approach? I think that, yeah, the main thing that we need to recognize as sort of the general theme across these discussions, it seems, is that we need to stop thinking of AI as these perfect robotic beings. Like that's the way we imagine it, right? Which is that when we imagine AI, we imagine these from the movies, these perfectly logical, impartial robotic angels who should we give our lives over to them to decide in a realm of pure logic how we should do things, and can they explain what they do? But no, AI, as I said, is artificial. It's a trick. It's a thing that we make that pretends to be human, and you can train it to be smart, or you can train it to be racist, or you can train it to be completely stupid. It's whatever you want it to be. And so if you look at how we do, in cases where this matters, you always have defense, the term is defense in depth, for those of you not familiar in software programming, where we have gotten to the stage where the limit to how complicated a software system is not the amount of engineering hours you put on it, but it's the amount of complexity it gets before it starts developing more bugs as a result of the complexity. And so the way you do this is you basically have to write, when you're writing a complicated piece of software, even though it's one person, let's say even if it's one person writing it, at some point you have to write the different parts of your program, even written by one person, to assume that the other parts were written by an idiot, because you probably made mistakes. And so, for example, in the case of the self-driving cars, right? The way you do self-driving cars is not by having one self-driving AI and making sure it's super, super smart and never makes a mistake. The way you do it is you have multiple layered programs running. So my understanding, at least for self-driving cars, is that they have multiple brains, just like humans do, where they have the low-level reptilian brain, which is the don't crash into things brain, and then they have the high-level brain, the super high-level brain, which is the navigate and identify objects and then go around the brain. And then there's all the stuff and all the layers in between. And so that even if, let's say, you're not even thinking about something and you accidentally put your hand on the stove, your low-level brain it's whoa, that's hot, and you don't do that. And so you have these interlocking systems so that they weave together. And so we should, I think my general opinion, I mean, obviously this is a sort of broad statement to make, but the general opinion is that when you're doing things like AI, you should ask yourself, what would I do if this thing worked about 60% of the time? Only worked about 60%. Maybe you got it really good. Maybe your AI is real smart and it works 99.9% of the time. But let's say, how would I design this if I had a system that worked 60% of the time? And the way you would do it is not say, this is useless, it's only 60% and I throw it away. You'll say, okay, this is 60% of the time. And so I take a bunch of different 60% of the time systems and I overlap them in a sort of efficient manner. Then I will get something that actually works pretty reliably, because when one thing fails, the other thing succeeds. And so you don't ask, what happens if it fails? You ask, okay, when it fails, what's the contingent mode? And you layer this deep enough such that you then don't care. And so, I mean, hopefully that answers your question, which is yes, I think the heterogeneity is, I think we are right now in the general zeitgeist of how people think about AI is angelic robot overlord. But once we start realizing that AI is just more crazy robot that someone made and there's a whole bunch of them, but they can still be useful, we will naturally go towards more heterogeneous systems.
All right, so some people it's angelic, and some people may think it's the opposite. Who knows? But I'm going to keep moving around quickly because I do want to try and.
Didn't follow up on how to make the feedback systems, because I mean, if something happens, it takes a while before it propagates back.
Yeah. So the feedback systems are going to have to be so end-to-end principle of system design. The feedback systems are going to have to include all of society and our justice system, which is that let's say. like, so for example, with companies, right? So let's say a company has a cybersecurity failure. If you just say, oh, well, those are computers and computers are hard and you don't punish that, then you're going to have more cybersecurity failures. But if you say, if a company has a cybersecurity failure and a lot of private data leaks out, and then you go after them and you sue them and the government like fines them and charges them, then turns out companies are going to start freaking out a lot more and putting a lot more resources into making sure they have good cybersecurity. I think the same thing is going to have to happen with AI. Like, you can mandate as much as you want about the AI system itself, but I think you're going to have to include the companies and human society as part of that loop and feedback system, which is that rather than trying to like mandate particular AI standards, I think you have to mandate outcomes and then hold people accountable for the systems that they build. And if you do that, then that feedback loop will be like if you find if every time an AI a self-driving car crashes, you don't find them at all, you're going to have a whole bunch of crashes. Not infinite, because they still you still need to make sales and things like that. But if every time an AI car crashes, you find them like $10 million, you will have a lot fewer crashes. And that's the feedback loop. A simple example of this is for credit cards. If I remember correctly, I don't know whether this still is the case, but I think previously the UK used to have a lot higher instance of credit card fraud than the US. And people they had all these systems to check, right? They tried enforcing the ATMs a lot harder. They tried like making them hack-proof. They tried improving the software, but they still had a lot more credit card fraud than or rather ATM fraud than the US. Sorry, not credit card, ATM fraud. And it turns out that the problem was that in the US, if there was ATM fraud, the onus was on the bank to prove that it wasn't. And so me as a customer, I could just be like, oh, this was fraud, and they have to give me back my money unless they prove otherwise. In the UK, the onus was on the customer to prove that it was fraud, in which case, obviously, the customer doesn't have any way to do it. And so the banks in the UK didn't put any effort into trying reducing fraud, whereas the US did. And so it wasn't a technological problem, it was a control loop problem, including humans as part of that control system.
Can I add something, sorry, to this? I just wanted to say one thing that I find useful, and I think it's as important, very important for engineers as well, is whenever you're building a software system, of course, you have one column that says, if everything works, this is how it would be. If everything fails, this is how it will be. But for AI and for all tech, I would encourage you to have a third column, which is called unintended consequences, which is not about it failing at what it's supposed to do, but actually spawning a new problem altogether. And that is what will make us in Singapore really thought leaders, if every time we are educated and we are thoughtful and we think like that.
So I guess it's interesting when we think about corporates. Corporates can be held accountable, governments hard to hold accountable, so I guess we're back to this scenario of depends on which government and where and what their use cases are. Yes?
I think it's perfect that you just raised that. My scenario in my head is actually like Aladdin and the genie in the lamp. One day AI may be assembled by 18-year-olds the way they assemble malware and viruses now. So if someone wants to send out an AI genie to take revenge on someone else, what do you think are the criminal and civil liabilities of private ownership versus what we're talking about now, which is more institutional and corporate ownership? Thank you.
That's a good question, actually, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that regulation is still trying to catch up with those people, but maybe Hong, you know, but I am not familiar with the law. But there should be some consequences, I'll say that much.
All right, so I'd preface by I am not a lawyer and I barely know the difference between criminal and civil to begin with. But just in terms of like how you deal with this, so that is why I think the court system needs to be part of this end-to-end sort of like management, because as much as we would like to have everything defined, as human beings, our ability to recognize things is far exceeds our ability to describe them. If that makes any sense. And so that's why the court system works, because we can say that, murdering someone is bad. And we don't write down like murdering means like, oh, let's say if I left the knife on the floor and you fell on it, is that murder? And then like, if I threw it at a wall but you happen to be, is that murder? If I happen to know that you are allergic to peanuts and I put it in front of you and I put it in your food, is that murder? And like, these are all questions which have a lot of, the description of murder can be infinitely deep, but the recognition of it is non-trivial, but something that we are better at. And I think similarly, when you're governing these AI things, you're going to have to, like, this is sort of like counterintuitive, at least for me, something that I struggle with as a sort of like computer scientist, which is that like when I say rules, I want things to be like really, really, really well defined. But I've come now to the perspective that you are necessarily going to have ambiguity in the exact definition and rely on sort of on a heuristic recognition-based system where, let's say in terms of the liability, civil and criminal liabilities for like releasing malicious genie AIs or whatever the hell you want to call it, right? So for example, let's say I was you're going to have to write. Let's say someone specifically codes something and gets together a bunch of bots and targets someone to hack their private photos and send them out to the internet, right? Whereas someone who was just mucking around and pushing buttons on their computer and was like trying this tutorial and accidentally did it. Mechanically, there's no difference in the action, but the intent makes a difference, right? And that's, again, not a lawyer, but I understand that that's a part of the law, that like your intent does make a difference in terms of not just your action, and we are going to have to do something similar where you have to write laws which recognize, yes, there are different steps you can do, but no matter how much you hide behind, we're like, well, what if I program the bot to program the machine, or what if I program something to hire someone to program, like I could write a script which goes onto one of these like freelancing websites and post a job to hire someone to build the AR, and you can do infinite steps of removal. And that's the point. It can get arbitrarily complicated, and because of this, your descriptive capability is going to necessarily be curtailed and rely on a recognition-based capability. And so you are going to have to write at a high level that do not hack people. Hacking people is bad. And while this might seem to the computer scientists among us woefully underdescribed, I think that is a necessary part of dealing with the infinite complexity of human society and your levels of indirection in order to achieve outcomes.
And guess what? That's a new job of the future. And actually at Yale, that's one of the most popular courses for first-year Yale law students is robots and law. So I think this is a classic example of the new kinds of jobs that we'll see.
So it's sort of like the Supreme Court justice that was asked about what constitutes pornography. And he said, I don't know how to describe it, but I know it when I see it. Which is, you sometimes don't know, but you intuitively can say, that's not right.
Right, and a very mechanical sort of like manifestation of this is our ability to draw. Right? So as human beings, I don't know how many of you are artists, but I'm not. I'm a horrible artist. But like, I go around and I quite happily recognize my friends and I recognize my home and I recognize things in my life. But if you were to give me a piece of paper and ask me to draw my mother or father's face, I would not be able to do. I would be horrible. Like from memory, you go and be like, and so even though in your mind you're like, obviously I know what they look like, but when you actually start to like draw it out, and this is a skill that artists develop, which is that they recognize that their recognition abilities and their description abilities are not synchronized, and they need to train to get this up. And so I think as humans, we don't quite recognize how big this gap is. And so the answer is, which is like, I don't know, but I know it when I see it, is actually very true for the vast majority of how our brains work.
All right, so I'm running out of time. I know there was a question. I'm going to try and go super quick. So ask, and then I'll come back to you. And then if we can, as panelists, just be like as best we can. Go ahead.
Airport recently where you use facial recognition, a mirror that use facial recognition to give you the pass to your plane and as well as your departure time. It's causing no problem in society. So how do we?
So why don't I take it? I'll take it off of the concept of AI for good and more just, if I can think about it, this, again, asymmetric adoption, asymmetric use. So San Francisco, one of the bastions of innovation, and Hong, you were obviously there for years with Google, said no. China has said, yes, please. So how do we want to think of this in brief terms, is that good or bad, or do we not have a good or bad definition for that use?
Okay, I think that, and coming back to your original question, I think that these kind of regulations do differ by country for some time. I mean, they are, and over time regional, then regional consensus will arise, such as the European Union. In Asia, we might have ASEAN. Now, you also have to look at the context of these things. Now, I know, for example, if you had asked me before I'd had my kids that I'm going to put cameras everywhere, and I would, at the East Village, like partying, I would have, in New York, I would have said, this is a violation of my, civil liberties. But now I have kids. If they're lost, I'm worried about them. I don't mind if they're CCTV cameras. So I do think that we need to think about certain things. I come from, originally from Pakistan, and I know that my co-founder was able, and a team of 3 people, they were looking for a pedophile rapist. He killed 16 little girls. They could not find that man, that monster, what he did to them. Amongst millions of men, they applied AI neural networks to call data records, and they identified 9 men in a city of millions, and one of them was that person. So China, we talk about China, but there are a billion people over there as well. So, it's not easy to always jump to conclusions is all I would say. And in terms of San Francisco, I think they have come up with this legislation, but it doesn't actually, it's not going to be implemented. It's just something that they passed. But I would like to see if they stop using CCTV cameras. They're all over London as well, for example. So I think that
surveilled cities in the
I
world.
think societies will come to some agreement. And over time, hopefully that's done in a way that everybody agrees on. So that's all I would say, that everybody in a country should agree on it. And then if you're dealing with the citizens of that country, then you have to respect that country's law. We are GDPR compliant. When we do anything with European citizens, we have to respect the way the European Union says they should be treated. So there is compliance to that country or to that region. And I think that's a good first start. Instead of trying to blanket, throw out some one rule for everyone. I don't think that's practical or feasible.
And it's sort of a Maslow hierarchy of needs, if you'll forgive the comparison, which is, I would be surprised if anybody in the room, because I always ask this question just for fun, how many people in the room are against facial recognition? They feel it's intrusive. And then you say, how many people would like security services not to use it in airports when you're wondering who's going to get on the plane and everybody kind of puts their hand down? Of course you want those things. So we have to then continue the discussion, but not in what case. You want it in that case. What case do you not want? Yes, please, your question.
Aisha just now referred to explainability, and I think that's going to be one of the big, thanks. So Aisha just now referred to explainability as one of the 3 things, and that's going to be probably a huge challenge moving forward. So I'm in healthcare, and when a doctor makes a diagnosis and explains to the patient, oh, this is how I arrived at it, I looked at your scan, I took your bloods, I examined you and all that, patients normally would accept that. They might get a second opinion, but again, it's in the similar way, right? They go to another doctor and then they get, go through the same thing, or again, and then get another diagnosis or the same diagnosis, and that's how we've worked along so far. Now, when an AI system gives the diagnosis, so I think the challenge is definitely going to be the acceptance of that diagnosis, because is the AI system going to be able to explain how it arrived at a diagnosis, for instance? And the worry is that, as mentioned just now, there's going to be a level of supervision for a while, like it's an apprentice, right? So there's going to be a level of supervision. What happens when that level of supervision is taken off? How are people going to accept that a computer is making a decision and there's no element of humanity in it? I think that's, I'm not sure whether there's a way we can approach it, to stave off a challenge in terms of acceptance by the public.
So it's fairly interesting. Thankfully, this problem has already been addressed for the last few hundred years in terms of corporate governance. Simple example, right? There are plenty of, obviously this is the slightly cynical view, but the adage is that consultants are people to pay to tell you what you already want to hear, and that's kind of it, right? Which is that this is a common problem, which is that there are things which are right, and we know, and there are things that we need the right person to say it at the right time, and if human beings want, so traditionally, when we are sort of more xenophobic, we're like, I want the doctor of my race to tell me these things, or I want want someone who speaks my language to tell me these things. And I'm not going to listen to you just because you are from another country, you're different, your skin color is different, you speak a different language, or like even just religiously you are different, even if it's the exact same point. So sort of general problem with humans, not AI specific. But in terms of like with this, right? Yeah, so I think it's going to be a cultural thing. Again, with the planes, it's a question of level of trust. So you have, let's put it this way. Booking flights, travel agents are sort of these quaint little things that still exist. And the question is, well, it's so much cheaper to book things online and faster book things online. Why would I go talk to a human being and have them book it for me? And it turns out that is a service that people pay for. And I think there's not going to be an answer. It's going to be an industry where, like, for human beings who are quite happy to go through this fast, efficient thing, they will do it. And for people who want to pay human doctors to tell them things, they will do that too. And there's just going to be a range of stuff going on. And I mean, for those of you in health, for those of you who work in healthcare, well, know that, like, yes, there's your job as a doctor, which is looking at the patient, looking at results, and coming up with a diagnosis. And then there's an entire like section of doctoring, which is called bedside manner, and like that actually has a very huge impact on like how many patients you get, how much people come back, and this just sort of gets rolled into that a little bit, where some people care a lot about it and some people don't, and then you're going to pay more or less from it. Now the question is sort of like regulatorily, who's responsible. And I think this is something that we're going to have to build some sophistication around, so let's say, so if a doctor looks at a bunch of slides and makes a misdiagnosis, who's responsible? Well, right now it's like, duh, it's the doctor, right? Because you looked at it and you're responsible. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're like, well, actually looking at this, a reasonable doctor would have even if it was a mistake, it wasn't a huge mistake. I can see how he made that misdiagnosis, and therefore I'm not going to punish him. Now, let's take that out. So the doctor is like, oh, an AI told me that this was the thing. Now, like 5 or 6 years from now, depending what the cultural acceptance we come to is, are we going to accept that? Yes, an AI told you so is a good enough excuse, or an AI told you so is not. And both of them could be reasonably fine. Like that really is fine. You can't answer that philosophically. You have to answer that empirically, which is that if the AI really get to the state where they are doing so complicated things that you just have to they are getting diagnosis just way better than you would a human, and a human's like, yeah, the thing told me so. Okay, and we already do this to some degree, but it's going to be cultural rather than philosophical.
Okay, quick one on that. I mean, some of the things like our productivity tools. So SG Innovate's invested in a company that's doing computer vision for pathology. The whole idea is pathologist looks at 1,000 images, tries to say these 900 look fine, these 100 I need to look at more detail, these 10 I need to really study. Takes a while, and there's a constraint on how many images based on how many people and based on speed of response required. If you can have a computer vision aided tool that allows a segmentation to say, don't worry about those 900, and then that pathologist can still do a fact check, but just different than trying to look deeply at each and every image. So can we speed up? Can we improve? It doesn't replace the doctor. It's meant to be an assistive to the doctor, and everybody with whom we've spoken said, hurry up and get that over to me. So when you think about today, doctors are learning systems. Do you want a 33-year-old doctor that's just finished residency? Probably, because he or she has access to a lot of recent medical research. Do you want a 65-year-old doctor that's seen patients for 40 years? Probably, because they've got a lot more experience working with people. So how do we try and think of those in AI terms? Last question from somebody, please. Oh, that's unfair. I mean, if we can, tell you what, just ask both, and if they're somewhat similar, go ahead, Debbie.
I'm just going to do a quick one because I like the discussion. I like the discussion and the debate that we're having on AI for good, because this might seem paradoxical and contradictory. So the question I have is a little bit philosophical, is it possible even for engineers to write the code of ethics and morals into lines of codes and to make AI accountable for that? A little bit more philosophical, so that we don't have an Orwellian situation developing at some point in time.
Okay, and? Yes, please.
I think we spend a lot of time talking about technology today, but I really think sometimes the biggest problem is rather the social issues. I mean, I'm sure the technology for the autonomous car is ready, but the question is, like, for example, in the case of Singapore, we're using the taxi trade as an unofficial safety net for the elder Singaporeans, who are retrenched. I mean, if we're going to adopt this sort of things too quickly, the impact on society will be tremendous. I mean, I think this is the sort of things that I didn't think I hear enough about. I mean, of course, I think in the long run, if you read things like gun jumps and steal. If we are free from the mundane for tasks of searching for food, repetitive things, we are definitely capable of pushing the, technology or production possibility boundary, but that will take time. In the short term, how do we deal with the disruption? Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll just bundle those together in this idea of society and implications, and taxi drivers is a good example, because if we have autonomous vehicles and there's an implication, it's not obvious that this concept of, well, let's just retrain them or just give them new skills. So how do we think about this implication, Aisha?
Okay, so I'll take yours first, which is, can engineers code ethics into the programs? Yes, they can, but whose ethics? So I think the idea is, and what is ethics? Like, who decides? So the classic question of, what everybody asks me at every panel, which is there's a car coming, it's an autonomous vehicle, there's a pregnant woman with twins, or there's a 90-year-old man and can kill only one of them, which one would it kill? And the thing is, like, can a human, that was the first question in my justice class as an undergraduate. There is no good answer to that. It's called a moral dilemma. And we are the ones who code the values into the machines. So at some point, what you're talking about is, it's a combination of, what are the regulations, what is the law saying in terms of what it considers acceptable, and then what are the business people and the engineers together. So here's what I would caution against, which is the old way of doing things, which was when tech used to be the back office. We'll tell the tech what to do. That was very last century. Now tech is right next to you, and you have to work in a team where together you decide the best way to embed the moral values of your society, of your company, and of your government and fellow citizens into the code itself. So yes, you can embed the code, but the question where everybody gets confused is what do we agree on together? And then coming to disruption, I think you have a very good point. I think we need to deal with this. Yes, there will be job loss. Yes, there will be some disruption. And what will those people do for that time? Can they be retrained or not? If we put them in other jobs, will they find it meaningful or not? Now, this may be just for a smaller part of society who are maybe more elderly, but we still need to talk about it. And there is no good answer at the moment. So I think that all the governments in the world are beginning to think about how to create a security layer, how to create a floor, but also how to help these people find meaningful work. I'll tell you how I think I could find it. We are teaching lots of people across Singapore the basics of AI, and we are kind of looking for senior citizens to come in and help facilitate those courses, because they know so many things and they're always interested in talking about their experience, and a lot of AI is about problem solving. So that's what I've thought about, which I genuinely think is useful, not philanthropic, but I actually think it's very useful. And I think that's what we need to find. We don't need to dismiss people. We all have something that's useful in the new economy. We just need to help each other find it.
So maybe what we'll do is instead of thinking about senior citizen, we'll say with people that have more life experience, can definitely be helpful. What I want to do is always make sure that we leave time for interaction and discussion in this sort of a setting. So the trolley problem, as it's also sometimes called, as Aisha articulated it, is also an interesting question. Why do we assume that we as individual human drivers would make the optimum choice when faced with that dilemma? And so we always impose on AI that it somehow must be flawless, and I think that's back to Hong's earlier point. We're all flawed, AI will be flawed, but we try and think of it as some sort of super entity. I really wanted to ask about AGI and this idea of artificial general intelligence and the idea of whether there is a moment, a tipping point in moment, singularity and so on, but just too many other things to cover. So why don't we break now and have some time together. Thank you to Hong and thank you to Aisha. Thank you.